So I took my first ever Uber taxi, and it was a very interesting experience. And in this video, one, I want to talk about what it was like, because it was very odd to an extent. Like, both odd, but also kind of seamless at the same time is very interesting. And two, I just want to see what everyone thinks about this, because I wonder what this means for the future. Because I have seen here and there, and I've actually talked about this, I think it was like last year, that there was some word that Uber, which is like the definition of irony, was starting to work with taxi drivers and taxi companies to say, hey, you know what? If someone orders an Uber, and let's say there's not a lot of Ubers around, what if instead a taxi shows up? I feel like it's almost like when Netflix made a TV show about Blockbuster. You know, like it's kind of like that kind of same vibe. So this is what happened. I was with one of my friends going to a concert. Being more specific, it's Fred again, if anyone listens to him. Phenomenal electronic artist. And I was with her. She ordered the Uber, right? So on chest, she ordered it, I did not. So she orders it as normal. Not anything different. She orders it to the venue. That's it. It's not like there was any special thing she put in. It's not like she hit a special like Uber taxi button. It was a normal Uber she ordered. Then we go outside and she's like, oh, like it's going to be here in a minute, or it's already here. We go outside and we're looking around and there's no cars. She goes, it's here. And then I see a yellow car like right there, like right in front of her house. And I'm like, all right, so it's clearly a taxi, obviously. And I was like, wait, is that us? Like, I think we have a taxi. Because in my mind, it kind of sparked that article I read or did a video about, I think a year ago, of like, wait a minute. There was this weird thing I remember hearing about that Uber's now working with taxi companies or whatever. And she looks at her app, which she hadn't really, I think, like checked a lot before in terms of like the make, the model, the license plate. And she goes, oh, yeah, we have a taxi. So first off, which is interesting, you don't know what you're going to get. It's very possible for anyone watching this video that, like, say, when you go to order an Uber, I don't think Lyft is doing this. I think it's just Uber. When you go to order an Uber, it can give you a taxi without you knowing it's going to be a taxi or not. It's not like it didn't ask her, hey, is a taxi okay? It just showed up. So then we're like, oh, it's kind of weird, right? It's kind of odd. So we get in the taxi and it's kind of like odd because we get in and they're talking. They're like, oh, like here for Uber, I guess, right? Like, is that the best way to ask it? Obviously, we, make sure it's the right information. Everything's perfect. We sit in, we drive to the venue. So what's interesting about, I think, the process of being in that taxi is, it was a taxi. Like, is it, you're in a typical taxi. I was even looking and the person just used, a typical device. So it was kind of interesting that I think everything in terms of the ordering process to then being in the vehicle to then being dropped off, everything was the exact same as if we were taking a normal Uber. The only difference is we were in a taxi. That was actually about it. But it was weird that on the app, and this is what I thought was really interesting, there's got to be some like purpose behind this or a very strong intent. It didn't say, hey, just so you know, a taxi's picking up instead. It did not say that. It did not say that once on the app. But when we looked at the picture of the car, it did kind of look like a taxi. Right, so it almost kind of made it. I feel like it was interesting that it almost seemed like Uber didn't want to directly or even aggressively say, "Hey, you're getting a taxi instead." They just almost made it seem like it was just another vehicle, as if you're being picked up in a vehicle that looks like a taxi, right? And I feel like that makes some sense because I feel like if you order an Uber and like say a taxi showed up and Uber did give you an alert saying, "Hey, you're getting a taxi instead," I could see a lot of people being like, "Wait. Whoa, I don't have any cash on me. I don't have my credit card on me." Or, what do you mean I ordered? So I could see Uber's kind of intent behind being like, you know what? We're just going to treat it like any other vehicle, as if you're getting picked up by a Civic or any other sedan or any other vehicle, right? We're going to treat it like any other vehicle. So you get in the car as normal. They drop you off. That's it. It's not like there was like a fare either, like on most taxis. It was exactly like an Uber ride. And I gotta be honest, I'd say, when I look at this, especially now actually experiencing it, one, it was seamless. It wasn't anything. It was a bit weird because it did throw us off, being honest. It did throw us off because we're waiting there being like, we're waiting for an Uber that's clearly a taxi. And I'm like, I wonder if that's us. And then it turns out it was. So it was kind of interesting that Uber, although I get, like I said, the intent of not explicitly stating you're getting a taxi, they did show the picture and the make and model and the license plate, but it still was a bit tricky at first to like put two and two together. You know what I mean? Or I guess in this case, one and one together, the Uber and then the taxi. The second thing is, let me know what you think about this, because I feel like when I first heard about this, I felt a bit mixed. On one end, I feel bad because I know a lot of taxi drivers hate Uber and Lyft and the whole ride-sharing market, understandably. And it's kind of interesting that you're like, if you can't beat them, join them, right? It's kind of that methodology and that kind of mindset where I think for the taxi driver, he was probably like, hey, I'm just trying to make a living. I'm just trying to drive. I don't know as well. I didn't ask the taxi driver this because me and her were talking about like the show and everything. But like, I also was kind of curious, like, is it, let's say, the taxi company that put this in all taxis saying, hey, just letting you know, you might get a taxi ride like normal, but you also might get an Uber ride. This is not up to you. We're doing this now. Or is it on the driver's end? Did the driver say, and I know it depends on the rules and regulations of the taxi company, or did the driver say, hey, you know what? I'm not getting a lot of work as a taxi driver anymore. I'm going to sign up for Uber. If I get a taxi ride, I do that taxi ride. If I get an Uber ride, I'm going to do that Uber ride. It's almost similar to how most rideshare drivers drive for both Uber and Lyft. You get a ride with Lyft, you do Lyft. You get a ride with Uber, you do Uber. I wonder if maybe that's the same thing with like each individual taxi driver themselves, of if they sign up for Uber and then the taxi company as well, however they get their rides. I've never been a taxi driver, so I can't say from experience, right? But I also wonder, if, at the end of the day, if this is actually the best of both worlds. Although it was kind of confusing, I feel like maybe it does make some sense. Like I said, it's so similar, I feel like, to that Netflix Blockbuster analogy where Netflix making a TV show about Blockbuster, right? But I wonder if this is the best of both worlds, that although I know a lot of taxi drivers, like I said, hate ride sharing, they're frustrated by it and everything, maybe it's like, hey, you know what? If they can make extra money, because let's say for that guy who was driving, let's say he wasn't getting any taxi rides. Just it was a dead night, even though this is a Friday night in LA around when do we leave? Maybe around 8-ish or 7:38, right? So I feel like it was starting to become peak hours, but maybe he was like, you know what? I'm not getting any taxi rides. Hey, there's an Uber ride right here to this music venue. You know what? I'm going to do that instead. And this allows taxi drivers, in a good way, to continue making money, or in this case, potentially, I think, make more money now, as opposed to, like, say, if they could not drive for Uber with that vehicle, they'd just be sitting there, not being able to work whatsoever because they're not getting any rides. So I wonder if this is, like, the best of both worlds, although, again, you could also argue, with a lot of people not being the biggest fan of Uber right now, and Lyft as well, but let's talk about Uber. With a lot of people not being the biggest fan of Uber, some people might say, you know what though? Like, I don't like the fact that we're now being merged with Uber. Like, let's say, for example, the taxi companies forced their taxi drivers to start having to drive for Uber as well. They didn't have a control. If they get an Uber ride, you have to accept it type thing. I could see some taxi drivers not being happy about that, right? Because I have gotten a good amount of comments on this channel as well from taxi drivers hating on Uber and Lyft. And I get that, right? Of course, I know that's a huge clash. But also, a lot of them saying, look, Mark, I'm not going to lie. You know, I drive for a taxi. I'm a taxi driver. You know, I drive my taxi and that's how I make my money. I make more money than when I drove for Uber and Lyft. I've had some taxi drivers say they make more money, especially now where I think things have kind of settled. Like back in the day, Uber and Lyft was way cheaper than taxis and it was not even close, right? Now, though, I think things have gotten a lot better. I think with one, a big issue is price. Two, getting a taxi. I remember back in the day in Boston, this is now 2012 when I first moved there. So this is, of course, like well over 10 years ago. But I remember when the bars would close around 2:30 a.m. or 2 a.m. and you're trying to get a taxi around 2:15 and 2:30, it was not uncommon to walk around the city for an hour or two just to get a taxi. There were fights that would break out to get a taxi. I remember one time we were getting a taxi and a guy was like, yo, man, it's me and my girl. Can we steal your taxi? And we're like, no, we're going home. The guy's like, I'll pay you each $50 if we could take your taxi instead. And my friends were like, no, we got this. Like, it'd be a battle just to get a taxi to go home. So the second thing is with Uber and Lyft, it's very seamless and smooth and very reliable to get home. And then the third big one, which I feel like is now so outdated, but this is a big one, especially, I think it still happens a little bit like here and there, not as much, and that is going the wrong way. In case you didn't know, for all, like, say my, like, younger viewers, maybe like Gen Z, it was a big thing back in the day that when you get into a taxi, you would know, it's one of those weird things about society looking back on it. 90% of the time, you would know that the taxi driver would purposely kind of like judge you, or not maybe judge you, but like analyze you to figure out, are they from here or not? If not, I'm going to take them the long way just to try to steal money from them. And this happened all the time, all the time. Any single time you're traveling somewhere new, I feel like everyone did this, where let's say if I was going somewhere new and I'd never been there before, I try to pretend like I'm from it. I'm like, oh yeah, I grew up on the, and I try to make it up. And the only reason why is because like, I don't want the taxi driver to take the long way, so that way they can charge me more money. And this happens all the time. It was kind of crazy looking back on it that it was such a popular thing. Like there's one time even where like, and this happened to like my parents, I remember even, they grew up in Boston. They took a taxi. The taxi driver thought they were not from there, took them the long way, and they lost their mind, being like, what are you doing? We grew up here, blah, blah. And the taxi driver's like, oh, I'm sorry. And it was one of those things where it's like, on one end, it's messed up what he's doing, but on the other end, it's like, that's how typical it was. So that was a third huge issue with taxis. That was a massive thing that Uber and Lyft solved, that with Uber and Lyft, everything is seamless with the GPS. You knew that you were never getting screwed over, never really being taken this circuitous route just to make more money. That really wasn't a thing with Uber and Lyft, which is something, like I said, a lot of young people forget about, or maybe didn't even know that that was the case. Now, though, with taxis, every taxi has a GPS, or everybody has a GPS in their phone, where if you're in a taxi and, like I said, they're not using the GPS, they're just going off memory, which I think is super impressive, how taxi drivers are that good, right? Going straight off memory, you typically, for most people now, will take out your phone, look at the GPS, and follow along with them. And be like, all right, I just want to make sure they're not trying to pull like an old school taxi move of taking this on the circuitous route just to make more money, right? So I think with all these things being considered, it is interesting now that I feel like the merge of taxis and ride sharing, which is kind of an interesting thing, kind of makes some sense to me. The seamlessness of it, which, gotta be honest, when we ordered that Uber, when she did, it was pretty seamless, right? But like I also said, it is kind of one of those like bittersweet situations where on one end, this driver, for example, let's say, was not getting a lot of taxi rides. He was able to do Uber, right? Which means that if, let's say, one's not working, you got the other. That way you always, hopefully, have another ride on deck or on queue. On the other end, though, like I said, from a lot of comments on this channel, I know a lot of taxi drivers say they make more money now for Uber, doing taxis because, like I said, especially, I guess, jumping back to all these different points that I made about taxis versus Ubers, back in the day, the biggest thing is Ubers and Lyfts are so much cheaper. Now, with Ubers and Lyfts being pretty expensive, a lot of taxi drivers are saying, hey, with Uber and Lyfts being super expensive, and a lot of people are saying, I cannot believe I'm spending this much, especially with surges, for some taxis, they're like, hey, you might as well just go with us. I remember one time, for example, this happened like a year or 2 years ago. I think this was the first time I took a taxi, maybe since I started taking Uber and Lyft, I guess besides, like, unless I was like traveling, but like, it was one of the first times I took it here in LA, that I was in Hermosa Beach coming back to the LAX area, and I remember the surges were off the charts for Uber and Lyft. It was impossible to get one. It was one of those situations. Taxi driver said, hey, $20 plus tip. I was with a friend and we're like, done. We paid less money and got a ride quicker doing a taxi. And I think for a lot of people, as everyone knows, Ubers and Lyfts are so much more expensive now that there have been a good amount of people saying, you know what, let's just take a taxi instead. For example, in New Orleans, in case you didn't know, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. So the airport, the New Orleans airport, which is technically in a place called Kenner, to go to like to the heart of New Orleans, like say the French Quarter, for example, if you do that in Uber and Lyft, it is like $50 or something even more. It's a pricey drive, right? It's pretty far. But if you take a taxi, there is an actual law that does not allow the taxi driver to charge more than, I think it's like $20 or $30 or something like that. So it's actually significantly cheaper if, let's say, you're in New Orleans and you're at the airport or you're going to and from the airport to get a taxi. Never do Ubers and Lyfts in terms of the airport in New Orleans because it's that much cheaper, right? So this is a big topic of conversation of now with Ubers and Lyfts being more expensive than ever and a lot of drivers not being happy about driving, taxis are slowly making a comeback. And I've talked about this in a couple of different videos. So the integration, I just think, is interesting. And I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments because, like I said, to recap in terms of like the bittersweet parts of this, that on one end, I think it's good that, like, say, if you are a taxi driver, for that, and like say I'm making this up, for that next hour, it's a huge lull. When it comes to getting taxi rides, you can drive for Uber, make money. On the other end, though, I can see a lot of taxi drivers, and I stress the word if, they are forced to drive for Uber, I can see a lot of them saying, oh, I don't want to drive for Uber. I'm making way more money being a taxi driver. Even if I don't get ride after ride after ride as fast as Uber, I still might make more money just driving normally. And I'm more of an independent contractor where like I rent out the car or however they work it out in terms of the deal. I can just do it that way, and it's way more seamless, way more easy. I don't want to deal with Uber. But again, for those who drive for, like, say, Uber, and in addition, for those, like, say, who are taxi drivers, what do you think about this integration? Because it was way more seamless than I expected. It was so seamless, we didn't even know we ordered a taxi, if I put that in quotation marks, until it got there. Pretty interesting.